What if the line we've drawn between Neanderthals and modern humans is more about politics than science? Imagine two groups of humans living side by side, hunting, sharing tools, interbreeding, and even creating art. Are they really so different that we must call them separate species? Or were they simply variations of the same ancient family? And if the evidence points toward unity, why does one of the world's most powerful museums insist on dividing them? The answer is not just about fossils or DNA. It's about how we tell the story of human origins and who gets to control that story. For decades, the story of human evolution has been told in neat categories with tidy names attached to separate species, as if the past could be boxed and labeled like drawers in a museum. But when we look closer, at Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons, the first Europeans, the truth refuses to fit those labels. And a deeper question emerges: were they really two different species, or were they simply two populations of the same one, Homo sapiens? This question is at the heart of a growing debate in paleoanthropology, fueled not only by fossils and DNA, but by the politics of institutions like the British Natural History Museum, which insists that Neanderthals must be classed as Homo neanderthalensis separate from Homo sapiens despite overwhelming evidence of interbreeding and shared culture. The biological definition of a species has long been based on the ability to produce fertile offspring, and by that measure, Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons were not just neighbors but family modern humans outside Africa, carry around 2% Neanderthal DNA, a genetic legacy that proves when these groups met, they mixed, and those children had children of their own across generations, producing lineages that continue into the present day. If two groups can blend their genes seamlessly, doesn't that place them firmly within the same species under the biological species concept? Yet the museum's recent article, Neanderthals and Modern Humans Must Be Classed as Separate Species to Best Track Our Origins, pushes the opposite conclusion, citing morphological differences in skull shape or body build as decisive, but does appearance alone justify such a hard line? We can look at humans alive today and see enormous variation in height, skin tone, facial structure, and build shaped by geography and climate. Yet no one argues that an Inuit and a Maasai belong to separate species. Why then should thicker brow ridges or stockier bones condemn Neanderthals to a separate label? What makes the debate even more compelling is that the similarities between the groups go far beyond genetics. Both Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons buried their dead, sometimes with flowers or grave goods. Both used pigments, both fashioned tools with striking sophistication, and both engaged in symbolic acts like art, jewelry, and ritual. The idea that culture does not count in species classification, as some museum scientists argue, ignores the fact that behaviors come from brains, and brains are biological. If Neanderthals had the neural wiring to create meaning and mourn the dead, that capacity is every bit as much a biological trait as the slope of their foreheads. To dismiss this evidence because it is complex or harder to pin down is not just short-sighted, it is absurd. Fossils can be misinterpreted, DNA can be contaminated, yet those are never waved away as unreliable. Why then should cave art and burials be treated differently? If anything, shared behavior is the strongest bridge between groups, because it shows that they were not just genetically compatible, but socially and cognitively aligned. Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons lived in overlapping territories, often competing for resources, sometimes cooperating, sometimes blending into one another's lives. If they were truly separate species like lions and tigers, one might expect clear ecological separation. Yet what we see instead is overlap, interaction, and exchange. Their genomes differ by less than 0.1%, far smaller than the gap between humans and chimpanzees, and small enough to fall well within the variation of a single species. The insistence on separation seems less about evidence and more about narrative it supports. The traditional out-of-Africa model, which frames Homo sapiens as a superior species emerging cleanly from Africa and replacing archaic humans across Eurasia. But if Neanderthals are recognized as a subspecies, Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, then Homo sapiens were already present in Europe and Asia long before the supposed African exodus. And the story becomes one not of replacement, but of continuity and blending. This undermines decades of institutional storytelling and perhaps even donor-backed projects which have favored a tidy tree of evolution over a messy web. Yet science is not about tidiness, it is about truth. And the truth is that the boundaries between Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons blur wherever we look, genetically, culturally, ecologically. Behaviorally, they were variations of the same adaptable species. Homo sapiens, the refusal to accept this, risks turning science into ideology. Fossil drawers may prefer neat labels, but the evidence suggests a tangled family tree where Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons are not strangers at all but kin, whose legacy still lives in our blood. And perhaps more importantly, in the shared sparks of creativity and meaning that made them human in every sense of the word. When we move beyond bones and genomes and turn to the traces of behavior left behind by Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons, the story becomes even harder to divide into neat categories because both groups not only lived in the same landscapes, but also created worlds of meaning that echo across millennia. And to ignore that evidence, as some scientists propose, is to ignore half the definition of what it means to be human. After all, fossils can tell us how a skull was shaped or how strong a femur was. But it is burials, pigments, tools and art that reveal the inner life of a species. And in this realm, Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons appear less like rivals and more like siblings. Consider the fact that both groups buried their dead, deliberately sometimes, with objects or flowers, placed in the grave suggesting ritual and care. These were not accidents of geology, but conscious choices to mark death and honor the deceased, which points to symbolic thought and social bonds. Cro-Magnons famously painted breathtaking scenes on cave walls at Lascaux and Chauvet, images of animals flowing with movement and meaning. But Neanderthals too left their marks, pigments etched lines, hand stencils, jewelry fashioned from eagle talons and shells. This is not the behavior of a mindless brute, but of a being capable of imagination, symbolism, and creativity. And if both groups were producing symbolic culture in parallel, or even sharing practices through contact, doesn't that undermine the claim that they were fundamentally separate? Species behaviors come from brains, and if Neanderthals could think and feel in ways nearly identical to Cro-Magnons, then their biology must have been aligned enough to support that capacity. Yet the British Natural History Museum and papers like Homo sapiens, Neanderthals and speciation complexity in paleoanthropology argue that behaviors are too plastic, too easily changed or shared to be reliable markers for species identity. But this dismissal misses the point entirely. The very plasticity of behavior is itself a hallmark of humanity. And if Neanderthals shared in that plasticity, it connects them even more strongly to us. Yes, cultures can change quickly, but the capacity to create culture is deeply rooted in biology. A chimpanzee can learn to use a stick to fish for termites, but it cannot invent burial rituals or paint abstract art because its brain does not allow for that level of symbolic thought Neanderthals could and did, and that means their brains were working within the same range of possibilities as Cro-Magnons. The museum also argues that it is difficult to establish behaviors from the archaeological record, that pigments may have spilled accidentally, or that burials may not have been symbolic. But such hyper-skepticism rings hollow when the same uncertainties exist in fossil interpretation. Fossils are rare, fragmentary, and subject to bias. DNA is prone to contamination or gaps, yet we still treat them as valid sources of evidence. So why hold culture to a harsher standard when in fact it offers the most direct window into the lived experience of these ancient humans? The truth is that behaviors like burial and art are not secondary footnotes. They are the clearest signals of shared humanity. Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons were not just surviving, they were making meaning. And meaning-making is not a trivial matter. It is the essence of being human. The parallels extend beyond rituals and art to technology as well. Both groups crafted stone tools with extraordinary precision, both used fire, both hunted large game and processed hides for clothing. In fact, in some regions, Neanderthal toolkits were nearly indistinguishable from those of early Cro-Magnons, suggesting not only similar skills, but perhaps even direct cultural exchange if they could learn from each other, imitate and adapt one another's innovations. Then how rigid can the supposed species boundary really be? Even ecologically, the two groups defy separation. They often occupied the same valleys, caves, and hunting grounds. Their territories overlapped for thousands of years, and instead of one driving the other out immediately, we find evidence of coexistence, interaction, and blending. This does not resemble the sharp ecological separation we see in truly distinct species like lions and tigers or wolves and coyotes, but rather the fluid overlap of populations within the same species adapting to local conditions. Neanderthals' stockier builds suited the cold, while Cro-Magnon's leaner frames fit broader climates. But such variation is no different than the diversity of modern humans. Across continents today, one might argue that cranial shapes or body proportions mark a decisive split. Yet those differences are minor compared to the extraordinary overlap in behavior ecology and genetics. When viewed through this wider lens, the case for unity grows stronger every step of the way. And yet the institutional insistence on separation persists. Why? Perhaps because admitting that Neanderthals were us complicates the tidy story of human origins that museums and textbooks prefer. The out-of-Africa model thrives on clarity. Homo sapiens emerges in Africa around 200,000 years ago, spreads into Eurasia, and replaces archaic humans neat and clean. But if Neanderthals are classified as Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, then Homo sapiens was already in Eurasia long before modern Africans arrived, and the story becomes one not of replacement, but of merging assimilation and continuity that is not as clean for museum displays or press releases, and it threatens decades of narrative building and funding streams. Yet it may be far closer to the truth, because what the evidence consistently reveals is that Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons were not separate destinies, but intertwined strands of the same human web. Genetic studies show interbreeding was not a rare event, but an ongoing exchange that left lasting marks on modern populations. Archaeological finds reveal shared practices and innovations. Ecological data shows overlapping ranges and niches together. This evidence paints a picture, not of separate species locked in competition, but of diverse populations within Homo sapiens, interacting, sharing, and blending across generations. To call them separate is to impose artificial borders on a reality that was messy, interconnected, and fluid, just as human history has always been. And perhaps the real reason the debate continues is not because the evidence is unclear, but because the implications are profound. If Neanderthals were part of Homo sapiens, then the very definition of our species expands beyond a single origin point to encompass multiple regions and populations, evolving together through time. It blurs the line between us and them, and forces us to confront the possibility that the ancestors we once dismissed as extinct were never truly gone. They are still here in our genes, in our behaviors, in the shared spark of creativity that connects every human past and present and future. Beneath the surface of this scientific debate lies a deeper question about who controls the narrative of human origins, and why. Because the story we tell about Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons is not only about fossils and DNA, but about politics, authority, and funding. When the British Natural History Museum insists on drawing a hard line between Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis, it reinforces a simple linear story of replacement that supports the classic out-of-Africa model and maintains their status as the trusted gatekeepers of human history. But if Neanderthals are reclassified as a subspecies, Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, then the neat story collapses into a more complicated web of interconnections with roots in both Africa and Eurasia, and this threatens not only scientific reputations but also funding streams that rely on clarity over complexity. Major donors like the Kayla Foundation have poured millions into projects that frame human evolution as a straight line from Africa to the world, and institutions dependent on that support may have strong incentives to resist alternative models that blur boundaries or suggest that Europe played a larger role in shaping humanity than the traditional narrative allows. The danger is that science becomes entangled with agendas, and rather than letting evidence speak, we find conclusions shaped by what is easiest to market and fund, yet the evidence refuses to stay quiet. Genetic studies show ongoing interbreeding. Between Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons, archaeological finds demonstrate shared culture, symbolic thought and technological overlap. Ecological data reveals that their territories were not divided, but deeply intertwined, and together these strands of evidence point toward unity rather than separation. Still, the museum and its allies dismiss behavioral evidence as too plastic or unreliable, as if art rituals and burials are somehow less meaningful than brow ridges or bone density. But this reductionist view shrinks humanity down to skeletons, while ignoring the living reality of what makes us human behaviors come from brains. And if Neanderthals thought like us, felt like us, and created like us, then they were us in every way that matters. To classify them as separate, simply to preserve an old model, is not science. It is storytelling disguised as certainty. So the real question becomes, why are we so invested in keeping Neanderthals on the other side of a line? Perhaps because the myth of Homo sapiens as a superior invader, replacing a weaker cousin, is easier to digest. It gives us a clean origin story, a sense of triumph and a reason to see ourselves as unique. But the messier truth is that humanity has always been diverse, tangled and mixed. Neanderthals did not vanish as an inferior species. They were absorbed as family. Their DNA lives on in billions of people today. Their culture echoes in the parallel rituals and symbols. We still recognize their adaptations shaped our survival in cold climates, and their story is our story. The conclusion then is unavoidable. The separation is artificial, a construct that reflects the needs of institutions more than the reality of nature. If we accept Neanderthals as part of Homo sapiens, then we dissolve a false boundary and reclaim a fuller, more complex vision of our past one, where humanity is not a straight line, but a web of connections, a family with many branches intertwining across time and space. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all, that the lines we draw are often less about nature and more about ourselves, about the politics of who gets to define human identity and what stories are easiest to tell. But the truth revealed by fossils, genes and culture is richer and harder and far more human than any tidy narrative can capture. Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons were not separate destinies, they were one family.